Hello and welcome to another anatomy video, and today we'll be discussing the muscles found on the posterior antebrachium. In my last video I discussed a lot about the anterior antebrachial muscles, and the first muscle I identified was the brachioradialis muscle, located right here. I discussed how this muscle is a good muscle to identify when naming and locating the muscles, because this muscle is a separation between the flexor muscles located on the anterior antebrachium and the posterior extensor muscles on the antebrachium. So again, this is the brachioradialis muscle. And if you want to learn more about the origin, the insertions, and the actions of this muscle, you can watch it in my other video. The first muscle that I want to identify is just behind the brachioradialis muscle. This muscle is called the Extensor Carpi radialis longus muscle. This muscle, just like the brachioradialis muscle, originates on the lateral supracondylar crest of the humerus, located right up here, and you can see part of the origin right here on the right image. The insertion for this muscle is located on the dorsal aspect of the base of the second metacarpal bone. So right here, and you can also see the tendon on the right image inserting right there. That's the insertion point for the Extensor Carpi radialis longus muscle. The action of this muscle is to extend the carpal joint and abduct manus at the carpal joint. If we continue working our way medially, the next muscle belly, located here, is the next muscle that we encounter. This one's called the Extensor Carpi radialis brevis muscle. This muscle is easy to remember because it runs alongside the Extensor Carpi radialis longus muscle, but it's a tad shorter, hence its name is brevis and not longus. The origin for this muscle is just a little bit inferior to the lateral supracondylar crest of the humerus, it being the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, located right here. The insertion for this muscle is going to be the dorsal aspect of the base of the third metacarpal bone. So the longus is on the second, and then the brevis is going to be on the third. And I find that easy to remember, just thinking that the longus is taken at the base of the second metacarpal bone, and so the brevis has nowhere else to go but the third. Let me draw a circle where that's going to be, right here, dorsal aspect, base of third metacarpal bone. And you can kind of see a tendon right here on the right image, inserting right there. And the action of this muscle is the exact same as its longer version, which is going to be extend the carpal joint as well as abduct manus at the carpal joint. Okay, the next muscle after the Extensor Carpi radialis brevis muscle is this long muscle belly, and you can see all the tendons going out to the digits. This is going to be our digital extensor muscle. You can also call it the Extensor Digitorum muscle. The origin for this muscle is going to be the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. The insertion for this muscle is going to be on the middle and the distal phalanges of digits 2, 3, 4, and 5. So unlike the flexor side of the antebrachium, where we have two separate muscles going to the middle and another muscle going to the distal phalanges, we just have one muscle going to both middle and distal phalanges of digits 2 through 5. The action for this muscle is going to extend the carpal joint as well as to extend the interphalangeal joints of digits 2 through 5. Now the last of the major superficial muscles on the posterior antebrachium is this one right here. Seeing that this muscle is located on the ulnar aspect of the antebrachium, you can guess that this muscle is going to be the extensor carpi ulnaris muscle. The origin for this muscle, again, is going to be the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, as well as the proximal posterior aspect of the body ulna. So here's the ulna, proximal posterior. So right here, as well as the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, is going to be the origin for this muscle. The insertion for this muscle is the base of the fifth metacarpal bone. So right here, in blue. The action for this muscle is going to be extend carpal joint and adduct manus at carpal joint, which makes sense because the muscles over on the lateral side are abducting, and this is the most medial posterior antebrachial muscle, which is going to be adducting. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and move on to the next image. After having removed some of the more superficial muscles of the posterior antebrachium, we can see a lot of the muscles that lie deep to them. The first one I want to cover is this larger one. It's located right here, and this one's called the abductor pollicis longus muscle. The origin for this muscle is actually found on the posterior aspect of the body of both radius and ulna. So located right here is where the abductor pollicis longus muscle originates. The insertion for this muscle is on the lateral side of the base of the first metacarpal bone. So right here, lateral aspect, base of the first metacarpal bone, which makes sense. This allows it to abduct when the muscle contracts. The action for this muscle is to extend the digital joints of the thumb as well as abduct thumb at the first carpometacarpal joint. Sorry, ran out of room there. First carpometacarpal joint. The next muscle is just distal to the abductor pollicis longus muscle, and this one's called the extensor pollicis brevis muscle. The origin for this muscle is the posterior aspect of the body of the radius, and it's also originating from the antebrachial interosseous membrane. So let me go ahead and draw that. So posterior aspect of the radius, as well as on the antebrachial interosseous membrane, which would be found between the radius and the ulna. The insertion is going to be the dorsal surface of the proximal phalanx of the thumb. So it's going to be located right here. And the action for this muscle is going to be extend the metacarpal phalangeal joint of the thumb, as well as abduct thumb at the first metacarpal phalangeal joint. The muscle belly just medial to the extensor pollicis brevis muscle is going to be the extensor pollicis longus muscle because it's much longer. Its origin is going to be the posterior aspect of the body of the ulna and the antebrachial interosseous membrane. So it's going to be on the other side, so instead of on the posterior aspect of the radius, it's going to be on the posterior aspect of the ulna. But it's also going to share that origin of the antebrachial interosseous membrane. The insertion for this muscle is the dorsal aspect of the distal phalanx of the thumb. So I actually cut off a part of it when I made this image, but it's going to be right here. It's going to be the distal phalanx of the thumb, so right here, the dorsal aspect. And you actually can see, if you look over on the right image, you can see the tendon coursing down all the way to the distal phalanx of the thumb. The action for this muscle is going to be extend digital joints of the thumb, abduct thumb at its first metacarpal phalangeal joint. The next muscle belly that I want to draw your attention to is just medial to the one we discussed. As you can see this distal end of this muscle belly, you can also notice that the tendon is coursing down the index finger, as I've colored in yellow. This long tendon coursing down the index finger should be a good clue that this is the extensor indices muscle. The origin is the posterior aspect of the body of the ulna, so back here. The insertion for this muscle is going to be the dorsal aspect of the proximal phalanx of the index finger. So it's going to course all the way down to the proximal phalanx of the index finger. So right here we have the proximal phalanx, so it's going to insert right here. The action for this muscle is just to extend the second metacarpal phalangeal joint. If we look closely after removing all the superficial muscles, that we have this long, slender muscle belly right here. This long, slender muscle belly belongs to the extensor digiti minimi muscle, which is easy to identify if we look over to the tendon, courses down to the fifth digit. The origin for this muscle is the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, so right here. The insertion for this muscle is going to be an interesting one. It actually fuses with the tendon of the digital extensor muscle. So the tendon of the digital extensor muscle that courses its way towards the fifth digit, it's actually going to fuse into that tendon. But it also does have its own separate insertion, which is going to be the proximal phalanx at the fifth digit. So it's going to help contribute to the proximal, distal, and middle phalanges at the fifth digit. The action for this muscle is going to extend the carpal joint, as well as extend all the digital joints of the fifth digit. Now the last muscle that I'm going to discuss in this video is technically classified as a anterior antebrachial muscle, but I've always found it easier to find it on a cadaver or even on a model when looking at the posterior antebrachium. This unique muscle belly located right here is going to be called the supinator muscle. The origin is the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, which is kind of funny because all the other extensor muscles originate there, unlike the flexor muscles, which originate on the medial epicondyle of the humerus. And the insertion for this muscle is just going to be the body of the radius. So all this over here. And just like the name suggests, it supinates the manus. Awesome. Now there's one extra tip that I want to give you, but first let me switch the slides. Now before I go ahead and give you this tip, I just want to make sure that you guys are aware that I find it super important that you're able to identify these muscles just by looking at them and not to rely on any abbreviations or tips and trips or little rhymes or songs to help you remember them. I feel that it's very important just by looking at the muscle structure, you should be able to identify the name of the muscle or even any bony landmark or organ that you're studying. However, but as a student, I also know that those little tips and tricks can also help that knowledge become more concrete. So this is the tip that I want to share with you when it comes to extensor muscles. So the majority of the extensor muscles originate on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. Extensor carpi radialis muscle is the only other muscle that originates on the lateral supracondylar crest of the humerus, apart from the brachioradialis muscle. So that's a unique characteristic that can help you remember that. So the tip that I want to teach you guys is called the longus brevis longus trick. And so the first thing you need to do is identify the brachioradialis muscle, which should be easy since it's such a large muscle. So I'm just going to abbreviate brachioradialis muscle. And then you go over to the next muscle belly, and then you say longus. The muscle belly following the longest one is going to be brevis. After that muscle belly, you go down to the next one, which is going to be longus. And then again, brevis. And then finally, you have longus again. And this is called the longus brevis longus trick. And the reason why, it kind of helps you get straight which muscle is the longest one and which one's the brevis, since there's so many on the extensor side of the antebrachium. The first longus is going to be the extensor carpi radialis longus muscle. The next one is going to be the extensor carpi radialis brevis muscle. Then you have abductor pollicis longus muscle. Then you have extensor pollicis brevis muscle, followed by extensor pollicis longus muscle. So again, extensor carpi radialis longus muscle, extensor carpi radialis brevis muscle, abductor pollicis longus muscle, extensor pollicis brevis muscle, and then extensor pollicis longus muscle. And that's the longus brevis longus trick that I wanted to share. Another tip, I think I already mentioned it, but when you have the extensor carpi radialis longus muscle, it inserts into the second metacarpal bone, and then the brevis inserts into the third metacarpal bone. So longus is first, and then the brevis is going to be in the third. So I find that an easy way to get those two sorted out. And I think those are all the tricks I have for you when it comes to the posterior antebrachial muscles. Again, I hope these videos are helpful, and you guys stay safe and study hard. Take care.